Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. Today we're taking a closer look at the world of solar power plants.
You know those fields of shiny panels you see popping up more and more?
Yeah, promising us all that clean energy.
Exactly. But have you ever stopped to think about what goes on behind the scenes, the business side of things?
That's what we're here to uncover today.
It's really interesting because we tend to picture solar power as this simple, eco-friendly thing.
Right, it's sunshine hitting those panels.
But the reality of running these plants is much more complex than that. There are some surprising factors involved, like how much land they actually need.
Oh yeah, reading through the research, I was definitely surprised by that.
It's not just a matter of setting up a few panels here and there.
Not at all.
One report actually pointed out that for the same megawatt capacity, you need about 10 times more land for a solar power plant compared to a traditional thermal power plant.
Wow, 10 times more land. That's a huge difference.
It is, and that's just for the same capacity. When you consider the actual power output, it gets even more interesting because that's where we run into this concept called plant load factor, or PLF.
PLLF. Okay, I'm not familiar with that one.
Think of it like this. Imagine a car that can only run for 20% of the day.
Okay, so it's sitting there for most of the time, not really doing much.
That's similar to how a solar plant works. It can only generate power when the sun is shining, and even then, the amount of power it produces can vary depending on things like cloud cover or the time of day.
So it's not a constant stream of energy like you get from a coal-fired plant that can run around the clock.
Solar plants have a lower PLF, typically around 20%, whereas a thermal plant can operate at over 80% as long as it has enough fuel.
So basically, to get the same output from a solar plant as you would from a thermal plant that's running constantly, you need a much larger area covered with those panels.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the issue of land acquisition.
Yeah, acquiring that much land must be a huge challenge for developers.
It is. It's a major hurdle they have to overcome.
You're talking about navigating land rights, dealing with regulations, and potentially even facing social and environmental pushback.
All of that comes into play.
So what are some of the solutions they've come up with to manage this land issue?
Well, one approach is the development of solar parks.
Solar parks, what are those?
They're basically dedicated areas where the land has already been acquired and prepared specifically for large-scale solar installations.
So it's like setting aside zones for solar development, kind of like industrial parks, but for clean energy.
That's a good way to put it. It streamlines the process for developers and reduces some of the initial risks associated with land acquisition.
I can see how that would be helpful.
Yeah.
But even with the land sorted, I imagine setting up a solar power plant is still a massive financial undertaking,
Oh, absolutely. The capital-intensive nature of these plants is a key characteristic.
meaning they require a lot of upfront investment.
Exactly. In India, setting up a solar power plant can cost around 5.3 crore per megawatt.
That's a serious chunk of change. So where does all that money go? Is it mostly about buying the solar panels themselves?
While the solar panels and inverters are definitely major components, they actually only make up about 60% of the total cost.
So what else is involved?
There's a whole lot more you have to factor in, things like site preparation, grid connection, financing, ongoing maintenance.
I guess even though we keep hearing about how the cost of solar technology is going down, setting up a large-scale solar farm is still a big investment.
It is, and that's one reason why we see a lot of those smaller scale rooftop installations. They're more accessible for individuals or businesses with limited capital.
Makes sense. If you want to play in the big leagues of those huge solar farms,
Yeah.
you need some serious financial backing.
You got it.
And speaking of financing, most of these large-scale projects rely heavily on debt, right?
They do. A typical solar project in India might be financed with a 75.25 debt to equity ratio.
Wow, 75% debt. That's like taking out a mortgage on your house, except in this case, it's sunshine powering those repayments, not your monthly paychecks.
That's a good analogy. And just like with a mortgage, those loan terms, the interest rates, the repayment schedules all play a crucial role in whether a solar plant sinks or swims.
Especially considering how much their income can fluctuate depending on the time of year.
Right, we were talking earlier about how solar power output isn't constant.
That makes me think there must be some real challenges with managing cash flow for these plants.
You're absolutely right. Those seasonal variations we discussed can have a big impact on a solar plant's power output.
You see peak production during those sunny summer months.
But then you have a dip during the monsoon season.
And what about places that get snow? How does that affect things?
Oh, and regions with snowfall production during winter can plummet to as low as 25% of what they generate in the summer.
Wow, a 75% drop? That's like riding a financial roller coaster.
It definitely presents some unique challenges when it comes to managing cash flow.
You have this income stream that's going up and down all the time.
But your expenses, particularly those loan repayments, are fixed. They don't change with the seasons.
So how do they handle that?
Maintaining a healthy working capital buffer is crucial.
Working capital, is that like having a rainy day fund for your solar plant?
Exactly. It's a reserve of money they set aside to cover those fixed costs like loan repayments and operating expenses, even when their income takes a dip.
So they can keep the lights on, so to speak,
Yeah.
even when the sun isn't shining as brightly.
You got typically solar plant operators aim to have a reserve equivalent to about 2 months of debt repayment on hand.
So it's like having a financial cushion to absorb those ups and downs.
Precisely.
This is really making me realize how much more there is to this industry than meets the eye. It's not just about harnessing the sun's energy, it's about navigating all these complex financial realities as well.
Exactly. It's a whole different ballgame behind the scenes.
And I know we've just scratched the surface here. We still have to unpack those power purchase agreements and the long-term relationships with panel manufacturers.
There's a lot more to explore.
But for now, I think it's time to give our listeners a moment to digest everything we've covered so far.
You know, before we took that break, we were talking about how a solar plant's income can be a bit like a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, those seasonal ups and downs.
Right, and that actually brings us to a pretty common misconception about solar power.
Oh, really? What's that?
There's this idea out there that the demand for solar power is like guaranteed
Ah, interesting.
and that the prices are fixed, thanks to those big auctions you hear about from organizations like SECI and NTPC.
Yeah, those auctions are meant to create those long-term contracts, the power purchase agreements or PPAs.
Exactly.
You'd think with those in place, it'd be pretty smooth sailing financially.
You would, but the reality is a bit different.
How so?
Well, those agreements are supposed to provide stability,
Right.
but a lot of solar plants still face challenges when it comes to actually selling their power.
And getting paid on time.
Exactly. There are a few reasons for this.
So even with those PPAs in place, it's not a guaranteed win for the solar plant owners.
Not necessarily. There are some hurdles they have to deal with.
Like what?
Well, sometimes there are delays in getting those transmission lines built.
Oh, right. You need a way to actually get that power to the grid.
Exactly. Imagine having this power plant all ready to go, generating clean energy.
But no way to transport it.
It's like having a factory full of products, but no trucks to deliver them.
That's got to be frustrating.
It is. And then there's the issue of grid curtailment. Have you heard of that?
I have, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Basically, it's when the power distribution companies, the discoms, decide not to buy the power a plant is generating.
Even if they're obligated to under the PPA.
Exactly.
Why would they do that?
Well, there are a few reasons. One is the fact that solar power costs have come down so much in recent years.
Right.
So discoms that sign those long-term agreements, say 10 years ago when prices were higher.
They might be feeling a bit stuck.
Exactly. They might be paying a premium compared to the current market rate.
So they're trying to get out of those older, more expensive contracts.
Sometimes, yeah, it's called repricing risk.
Repricing risk.
It's the possibility of discoms pushing to renegotiate those older PPAs and lower the prices.
I bet that leads to some interesting negotiations.
It definitely does.
So even with a contract in hand, there's no guarantee that a solar plant will be able to sell all of his power at the agreed upon price.
Right. And then on top of that, you have the issue of delayed payments.
From the discoms themselves.
Exactly. It's no secret that many state discoms are in a tough financial position, and that can create a ripple effect throughout the entire solar power ecosystem.
Leading to payment delays that can really impact a plant's ability to operate and pay off its debts.
Exactly. It's a big challenge for the industry.
It's like having customers who order your product but then take months to pay their bills.
Exactly. It can be a real headache.
So it sounds like understanding the counterparty risk, the financial stability of those you're doing business with is absolutely crucial in this industry.
It is. Solar power plants are locked into these long-term relationships, not just with their customers through those PPAs, which can last up to 25 years,
Wow, 25 years.
but also with their suppliers, particularly the solar panel manufacturers.
Yeah, we're talking about relationships that span decades.
Exactly.
What happens if your customer, or even worse, your panel supplier, goes belly up during that time?
That's where the reliance on panel manufacturers comes in.
Right.
You see those long-term warranties they provide often for 25 years as well.
Right. to guarantee the performance of those panels.
Exactly. And to cover any repairs or replacements.
But I imagine those warranties are only as good as the company standing behind them.
Absolutely. You're right. There have been reports highlighting how financially shaky some of these panel manufacturers are.
Especially with so much competition in the market.
Exactly. And if a manufacturer goes out of business, well, that 25-year warranty suddenly becomes
Oh,
worthless.
wow. So the solar plant owner would be left holding the bag,
Exactly. They'd be on the hook for any repairs or replacements.
potentially facing huge costs just to keep their plant running and fulfill their contracts.
That's right. It's a big risk.
Especially considering these plants are supposed to be operating for decades.
Exactly.
So how do they mitigate that risk?
That's where insurance comes in.
Insurance for the solar panels.
Exactly. Having a third-party insurer backing up those warranties can provide a crucial layer of protection.
So it's like having an insurance policy on your car if you get into an accident. You're not solely relying on the car manufacturer to cover the repairs.
Exactly. That third-party insurance can be a real lifesaver for solar plant owners if their panel manufacturer goes under.
It helps protect them from those unexpected costs down the road.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about land acquisition, the roller coaster of cash flow, and now these long-term risks associated with PPAs and panel suppliers.
Right. It's a lot to consider.
It's clear that this industry is not for the faint of heart.
It's definitely not a set it and forget it type of operation.
But despite all these challenges, I'm curious to hear about the potential rewards.
Well, one thing that's important to remember is that solar plants can be quite profitable,
Oh, that's good to hear.
especially from an operational standpoint.
Okay, so tell me about this operational profitability. What makes it so appealing?
Well, one of the big advantages of solar plants is that they have relatively low operating and maintenance costs.
Compared to other types of power plants.
Exactly. It's all thanks to the inherent simplicity of the technology.
Yeah, once those panels are up and running, it's not like you need to constantly be refueling a furnace or dealing with complex machinery.
Exactly.
It's just sunshine hitting those panels, generating clean energy.
Exactly. And you don't need a huge team of engineers and technicians on site 24/7.
But surely there's some level of maintenance involved.
Of course, there are routine tasks like cleaning the panels to make sure dust and debris aren't blocking the sunlight.
Right, I imagine that could significantly impact their efficiency.
You also need to inspect the wiring and connections and monitor the performance of the inverters.
So those are the main maintenance tasks.
Pretty much think of it like washing your car.
The cleaner it is, the better it looks and performs. So who handles these maintenance tasks? Do they have in-house teams or do they outsource it?
It can be done either way. Some plant owners have their own maintenance crews,
Well,
while others hire outside contractors. It really depends on the size of the plant, the availability of qualified personnel, and the cost-benefit analysis.
so it's a strategic decision.
It is, and I imagine technology plays a role here too.
Oh, absolutely. I bet there's a lot of automation and remote monitoring involved these days.
You're right. Advances in sensor technology and data analytics have made it possible to monitor the performance of these plants remotely and in real time.
So they can basically have a control room miles away, keeping an eye on everything.
Exactly. Those remote monitoring systems can track energy production panel temperatures and all sorts of key metrics.
So they can spot any potential issues before they become big problems.
Exactly. It's like having a digital doctor for your solar plant constantly checking its vitals.
It's amazing how technology is transforming this industry.
It really is. And with the pace of innovation these days, we can expect even more sophisticated automation and optimization solutions in the future.
It seems like this industry is constantly evolving.
It is. There are always new challenges and opportunities emerging.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from land acquisition to financial models to those crucial long-term relationships.
We have.
But before we wrap things up, I'd like to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
The role of solar power in the world.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in all the technical and financial details, but we can't forget that these projects have real-world impacts on communities and ecosystems.
You're absolutely right, and that's what we'll be exploring as we continue our deep dive.
Okay, so let's talk about those broader impacts you mentioned. What are some of the social and environmental considerations when it comes to solar power plants?
Well, remember how we talked about those vast land requirements?
Yeah, they need a lot of space.
Right, and acquiring that much land can definitely have social implications.
You can't just build these massive solar farms wherever you want without thinking about the people who live there.
Exactly. Land acquisition for these projects can be a really sensitive issue.
I can have it.
We've seen cases of social unrest and land disputes,
Really?
especially when local communities feel like they haven't been properly consulted or compensated.
It's like the classic story of development versus displacement, right?
Yeah. How do you balance the need for clean energy with the rights and needs of the people who live in these areas?
Exactly. So how can we ensure that these projects benefit communities rather than harm them?
Well, I think community engagement is crucial.
What do you mean by that?
Making sure that locals are involved in the planning process right from the start.
So they have a say in what happens.
Exactly. Transparency is also really important, being upfront about the project's potential impacts, both the good and the bad.
So open communication and collaboration with those communities from day one. Okay, so that's the social side of things.
Yeah.
What about the environmental impacts? We always hear about how solar power is clean energy, but are there any downsides?
Well, while solar power itself is clean and renewable, there are some environmental concerns related to the manufacturing and disposal of those solar panels.
Oh, right. I could see how making those panels could have an environmental footprint. But what about disposal? Don't they last for a pretty long time?
They do. The average lifespan of a solar panel is around 25 years.
25 years, that's pretty impressive.
It is, but eventually those panels do need to be disposed of, and we have to make sure that happens responsibly.
So they don't end up in landfills where they could potentially leak harmful materials.
Exactly. It's like with batteries or electronics, you can't just throw them in the trash.
Right, so what's the solution?
Well, there's a lot of research and development going on right now focused on recycling technologies for solar panels.
So we can recover those valuable materials.
Exactly. Things like silicon and silver and keep them out of landfills.
That's good to hear. It sounds like the industry is taking steps to address those concerns.
They are. It's important to remember that the push for clean energy needs to be sustainable across the board.
Not just about the energy itself, but the whole life cycle of the technology.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the world of solar power plants.
We have.
It's been fascinating to explore this industry with you.
It has.
And I think we've shown that it's a lot more complex than people might realize.
It's definitely more than just those shiny panels soaking up the sun.
There are a lot of moving parts.
A lot of factors to consider.
But I think it's clear that solar power has the potential to play a major role in our transition to a cleaner energy future.
Absolutely. It's a clean, abundant energy source.
And it offers a viable path towards reducing our reliance on fossil fuels.
Exactly.
Of course, there are challenges to overcome, as we've discussed.
There always are with any new technology.
But with innovation and collaboration, I'm optimistic about the future of solar power.
I am too.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive and that you've learned something new about the world of solar power plants.
And as always, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.
Until next time.